The tip of Aunt Vivian's manicured index finger trembled a fraction of an inch from my nose. The diamond cluster on her ring caught the warm light of the dining room chandelier as she pointed it directly at my face. The scent of roasted sage and expensive wine suddenly felt thick and heavy in my lungs. 20 people stopped eating. Forks hovered over porcelain plates. No one breathed. "Empty your purse," Gianna Vivian said. Her voice was a strained whisper meant to carry to every corner of the room. "And hand Richard your car keys. We know you took it." I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table. They had wedged my chair between a drafty bay window and a sticky high chair belonging to a distant cousin. I did not blink. I did not stammer a frantic defense or let the familiar heat of public humiliation rise to my cheeks. I kept my hands flat on the white linen tablecloth. I felt the stiff weave of the fabric beneath my fingertips. My Uncle Richard sat rigid across the room. His knuckles were white around the stem of his wineglass. My cousin Ashley wore a practiced look of shock, but her eyes held a distinct shine of satisfaction. They waited for me to crumble. For 15 years, I had been their convenient charity case. I was the designated scapegoat whenever their curated reality cracked. My leather tote bag rested on the hardwood floor by my boots. Inside that bag sat a crisp, folded sheet of paper that would soon turn this pristine holiday gathering into a smoldering crater. Welcome back to Aura Vengeance, where quiet boundaries dismantle loud arrogance. If you have ever sat at a family table and absorbed the blame for a mess you did not make, this story belongs to you. How old are you, and have you ever had to walk away from the people who raised you? Drop your age in the comments and be sure to subscribe. To understand why I did not cry when my own family called me a thief, you have to rewind 24 hours. I was standing in my high-rise office in downtown Boston. I am 32 years old, and I am a senior forensic accountant. My family thinks I am a struggling administrative assistant. They think I balance small business ledgers to make my rent. I let them believe this because the truth is much more complicated. I track hidden assets for high-net-worth divorces, and I investigate corporate fraud. I find the money people try to bury. I reached into my coat pocket and ran my thumb over the cold metal edge of a silver appraisal loop. It belonged to my grandmother. When I was 10 years old, she taught me how to hold it to the light. "People will always try to sell you silver-plated lies, Gianna," she would tell me. "You have to look at the hallmark." That small magnifying glass grounded me. It was the only real thing left of her. My family thought I was driving to Concord just for turkey and stuffing. They did not know the estate attorney managing my grandmother's lingering trust had hired my firm a month ago. Uncle Richard was the executor of the estate, and he had been missing critical filing deadlines. The court was asking questions. I had been quietly tracking Richard and his shell companies for weeks. I already knew exactly what he did. I was not walking into a family dinner as a victim. I was an investigator waiting for my target to trip the wire. I arrived at the Colonial Estate at 3 in the afternoon. The Massachusetts air was bitter and smelled of wood smoke. I carried 2 homemade bourbon pecan pies up the brick steps. It was a tradition I kept for my grandmother. Ashley met me in the foyer. She wore a tailored cashmere dress and a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Oh, you baked," she said. Her tone was the audible equivalent of a polite sigh. "Put those in the garage fridge, Gianna. We need the kitchen space for the catered pastries." I did not argue. I walked through the kitchen and placed my pies next to half-empty soda bottles in the freezing garage. The real effort was hidden away while the expensive fake display took center stage. When I walked back inside the house, the chaos had already begun. Vivian was pacing the hallway. A silver serving spoon was missing from the heirloom chest. She was raising her voice at the hired catering staff, blaming them for the misplacement. But I did not watch Vivian. I watched Richard. He stood near the staircase, staring down at his glowing phone screen. He hit decline. I caught a glimpse of the caller ID. It was a commercial debt collection agency. He was sweating through his cashmere shirt. The trap was set. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office on the 24th floor overlooking the Boston Harbor. It was Wednesday afternoon. exactly 24 hours before Aunt Vivian would point her trembling finger at my face across a Thanksgiving turkey. The firm was mostly empty. The junior accountants had already left for the long holiday weekend. I sat alone at my mahogany desk, bathed in the pale blue glow of 2 oversized computer monitors. My family believed I spent my days filing receipts for a mid-level paper supply company. They needed to believe I was small because their own egos required a baseline of comparison. The truth was, I managed the forensic accounting division for one of the most ruthless financial investigative firms in New England. I did not file receipts. I dissected them. I tracked offshore shell companies for high net worth divorce settlements. I uncovered embezzled corporate funds. I hunted the money that desperate people tried very hard to bury. Forensic accounting is not about math. It is about human behavior. A liar will always construct a narrative to hide their panic, but their bank statements will always tell the cold, hard truth. A thick manila folder rested on my desk. The label on the tab simply read, Estate of Beatrice James. Beatrice was my grandmother. She was the original owner of the Concord estate where Vivian and Richard now lived. She was also the only person in my family who ever looked at me and saw someone worth building up. When she passed away 2 years ago, she named Uncle Richard the executor of her estate. It was a traditional choice. The eldest son takes the reins. But Richard had spent 18 months dodging the probate court. He missed filing deadlines. He claimed the estate assets were tied up in complex appraisals. A month ago, the estate attorney called my direct line. His name was Harrison, and he was an old friend of my grandmother. He knew what I did for a living. He sat in my office and slid that manila folder across my desk. He told me Richard was stonewalling the final distribution of the trust. Harrison suspected Richard was hiding something, but he lacked the forensic tools to pierce the veil of Richard's corporate LLCs. I took the case off the books. I spent 3 weeks following the digital breadcrumbs my uncle left behind. Richard was a man who performed wealth. He drove a leased luxury SUV and bought Ashley designer clothes to project an image of untouchable success. But the spreadsheets on my monitor painted the portrait of a drowning man. His commercial real estate venture was bleeding cash. His anchor tenant had broken their lease 6 months ago. To cover the shortfall, Richard had quietly leveraged the secondary trust account. He was desperate for liquid cash to stave off a margin call that would expose his functional bankruptcy. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a small brass and glass silver appraisal loop. I set it on the glass surface of my desk. The metal was heavy and cool to the touch. When I was 10 years old, my grandmother Beatrice sat me down at her dining room table. The air smelled of lemon oil and tarnished metal. She placed a heavy, ornate teapot in front of me, along with that exact brass loop. She told me to look at the bottom of the pot. She guided my small hand until the magnifying glass brought a tiny, stamped lion into sharp focus. "That is the hallmark Gianna," she said. "That means it is sterling. It is real all the way through." She then placed a shiny modern tray next to it. It looked identical to the untrained eye, but there was no stamp. "People will always try to sell you silver-plated lies, Gianna," she warned me. "They will show you something bright and loud, hoping you will not check the weight of it. Always look for the hallmark." I kept that loop with me every day. It was my anchor. And it was the reason I knew exactly how Uncle Richard managed to find a sudden infusion of $14,000 3 days before Thanksgiving. While tracing the deposits into his failing LLC, I noticed a wire transfer from a high-end antique dealer located in the Back Bay. The name of the shop triggered a red flag in my memory. My firm was already running a separate compliance audit on that exact dealer for suspected money laundering. It was a fatal intersection of bad luck for my uncle. I did not call the police. I walked into the antique shop on Tuesday morning. I showed the nervous owner my corporate credentials and the official estate registry detailing my grandmother's heirloom silver collection, the collection Richard was supposed to be holding in trust. The owner realized he had purchased stolen estate property from an executor committing felony embezzlement. To save his own business license, the dealer handed over the itemized bill of sale. It bore Uncle Richard's messy, scrawled signature. But the receipt was not the devastating part. The dealer also handed over a thumb drive containing the shop's security footage. I sat in my dark office and clicked play on the video file. The screen flickered to life. I watched crisp, high-definition footage of my uncle walking into the shop holding my grandmother's velvet-lined mahogany box. I watched him smile and laugh with the dealer. I watched him trade a century of family legacy for a stack of banded $100 bills. He shoved the cash into his tailored coat pocket and walked out the door. He sold the only pieces of Beatrice I had left just to keep up his country club membership for another month. I folded the printed receipt and slipped it into a blank white envelope. I dropped the thumb drive into my leather tote bag next to the envelope. I did not feel angry. Anger is a chaotic emotion. Anger makes you sloppy. I felt a profound, icy clarity. I was not driving to Concord to argue with my family over old wounds. I was driving there to execute a controlled demolition. The next afternoon, the drive to the estate took 40 minutes. The sky hung low and gray. I wore a plain beige sweater and flat boots. I dressed specifically to match the version of me they wanted to see. You do not confront a narcissist by matching their volume. You let them believe they are the smartest person in the room until the exact moment they lock themselves inside their own cage. When I walked through the front doors of the Colonial House, the heat hit my face, along with the overpowering scent of Vivian's floral perfume. The foyer was loud with the voices of aunts and cousins drinking spiked cider. I carried my homemade bourbon pecan pies toward the kitchen. Ashley intercepted me with her condescending smirk, directing my effort to the freezing garage. I accepted the slight without a word. I placed the pies next to the spare sodas. When I returned to the hallway, Vivian was in a state of high theatrical distress. A silver serving spoon was missing from the credenza. She was pacing the hardwood floor, whispering harsh accusations about the catering staff she had hired for the afternoon. "Those people cannot be trusted," she muttered, adjusting her pearl necklace. I stood by the coat rack and watched Richard. He was lingering near the edge of the living room, far away from his wife. He pulled his phone from his pocket and stared at the glowing screen. His jaw tightened. He hit the red decline button. The caller ID flashed briefly before the screen went dark, but I recognized the name of the commercial debt collection agency. He shoved the phone back into his pocket and wiped a bead of sweat from his temple. The dining room doors opened. Vivian called us to the table. The grand performance was about to begin. I picked up my leather tote bag and walked toward the room. I felt the heavy brass loop tapping against my hip in my coat pocket. I was ready to look at their hallmarks. The crunch of gravel beneath my boots was the only sound in the freezing Concord air as I walked toward the towering front doors of the estate. The Colonial House loomed against a slate-gray sky. White columns framed the entrance. Perfect boxwood hedges lined the brick pathway. Every detail was curated to project an image of generational wealth and unbroken stability. I carried 2 glass pie dishes in my hands. The heat from the baked bourbon pecan seeped through my wool gloves. It was a familiar recipe. My grandmother Beatrice taught me how to make them when I was tall enough to reach the kitchen counter. I brought them every year not to please the current occupants of the house, but to honor the woman who built it. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into the foyer. The suffocating warmth of the house hit me instantly, followed by the sharp scent of cinnamon and expensive floral perfume. A chorus of overlapping voices echoed from the living room. Distant cousins and great-aunts holding crystal glasses mingled around a roaring fireplace. Before I could even take off my coat, my cousin Ashley materialized from the hallway. She wore a cream-colored silk dress that draped perfectly over her frame. A delicate gold chain rested against her collarbone. She held a pristine white bakery box tied with a satin ribbon. Ashley stopped when she saw the glass dishes in my hands. Her smile did not reach her eyes. It was a tight, practiced expression designed to convey pity. "Oh, Gianna," she sighed. Her tone was pitched to ensure the guests standing nearby could hear her. "You really went through all that trouble to bake. You should not have stressed yourself out. We ordered French tartlets from the patisserie downtown. They are setting up the dessert display right now, and the counter space is incredibly tight. Do me a favor and run those out to the garage fridge." She did not wait for my response. She turned her back and glided into the dining room. I stood in the foyer holding the warm dishes. I felt the weight of her calculated insult. In this family, the genuine effort was always banished to the shadows, while the expensive imported illusion was placed on a pedestal. I did not argue. Arguing with Ashley was like trying to punch the ocean. I walked through the crowded kitchen where hired servers darted back and forth with trays of hors d'oeuvres. I opened the heavy fire door and stepped into the uninsulated garage. The temperature plummeted. I placed my grandmother's pie recipe on a wire shelf next to a stack of half-empty diet sodas and a bucket of discarded ice. The visual metaphor was undeniable. I closed the fridge door and walked back inside. When I returned to the main house, the atmosphere had shifted. A sharp, tense vibration rippled through the hallway. Aunt Vivian was standing near an antique mahogany credenza. Her face was flushed, deep red under her immaculate makeup. She pointed a manicured finger at a young catering server in a crisp white shirt. The server looked terrified. "I laid the serving sets out myself this morning," Vivian hissed. Her voice was sharp and brittle. "And now the slotted silver spoon is missing. It does not simply walk away on its own. I want you to go back into that kitchen and empty every trash bag. If you misplaced it, I will ensure your catering company deducts it from your wages." The young server nodded frantically and hurried away. Vivian stood by the credenza, crossing her arms over her chest. She scanned the hallway with paranoid eyes. The missing spoon was a red herring. It was a minor inconvenience blown entirely out of proportion by a woman who needed to exert dominance over working-class strangers. But it set a dangerous precedent for the evening. Vivian had planted the concept of theft into the air. She watered it with her paranoia. I stepped back into the shadow of the grand staircase, leaning against the wooden banister. I preferred the periphery. From the edges of a room, you can observe the truth people try to hide in the center. That is when I saw Uncle Richard. He was standing near the coat closet. He was physically separated from his wife and the rest of the guests. He wore a tailored cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my first car. But his posture betrayed the expensive fabric. His shoulders were hunched. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscle twitched under his skin. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket. The screen illuminated his face with a harsh white glow. I watched his thumb hover over the screen. His hand was trembling. It was a subtle vibration, but my forensic training taught me to spot the micro-expressions of a man in deep distress. He swiped the screen to reject the incoming call. As he lowered the phone, I caught a clear view of the caller ID. It was the name of a notorious commercial debt collection agency based out of Chicago, the kind of agency that buys defaulted loans for pennies on the dollar and pursues the debtors without mercy. Richard shoved the phone back into his pocket. He dragged a hand across his forehead, wiping away a sheen of sweat. The ambient temperature of the house was warm, but Richard looked like he was fighting a fever. He took a deep breath, forced a wide artificial smile onto his face, and walked toward the living room to pour himself a heavy glass of scotch. The chiming of a crystal dinner bell cut through the chatter. Vivian stood at the threshold of the dining room announcing that the first course was ready. The crowd of relatives moved like a herd toward the long mahogany table. I waited until most of them were seated before I found my place card. The geography of a family dinner table is never an accident. It is a deliberate map of the social hierarchy. Richard and Ashley occupied the center seats of honor. Vivian sat at the head near the kitchen door to direct the servers. My place card rested at the very far corner of the table. My chair was wedged awkwardly against a drafty window frame. To my left was a wooden high chair holding a distant cousin's toddler. The child was already smearing sticky apple juice onto the linen tablecloth. I pulled out my chair and sat down. The cold draft from the window seeped through my beige sweater. The servers poured expensive red wine into crystal goblets. Richard took a long swallow of his drink. The alcohol hit his bloodstream, and I watched his desperate need to project authority return. A man drowning in secret debt will always try to pull someone else under to feel like he is standing on solid ground. He looked down the length of the table and locked his eyes on me. "So, Gianna," he called out. His voice boomed over the soft jazz playing in the background. The surrounding conversations quieted down. Relatives turned their heads to watch the exchange. "How's that little bookkeeping gig treating you in the city? Are you still filing receipts for that paper supply company?" He did not wait for me to answer. He chuckled, a low, patronizing sound. "I know rent in Boston is getting steeper every month. If you are struggling to make ends meet, my commercial real estate firm is expanding. I could probably find a spot for you as a junior administrative assistant. It would not pay much, but it beats whatever temp work you are doing right now." The table went silent. A few aunts offered tight, sympathetic smiles. Ashley took a delicate sip of her sparkling water, looking at me with profound condescension. They were waiting for me to blush. They expected me to lower my head and murmur a quiet thank you for the insulting charity. I looked at the man sitting in the center of the table. I looked at his tailored sweater and his crystal glass. I knew his bank accounts were overdrawn. I knew his anchor tenants had abandoned his buildings. I knew he was dodging calls from a collection agency. I knew he had sold my grandmother's legacy to a money launderer just to maintain the illusion of this exact moment. I picked up my water glass. I took a slow, calm sip. I set the glass back down on the linen cloth, aligning it perfectly with the edge of my knife. "I appreciate the thought, Richard," I said. My voice was level and entirely devoid of emotion. "But I am quite comfortable with my current position. You should focus your resources on your own firm's ledger." Richard blinked. My lack of defensiveness threw him off balance. He expected a flustered victim. He got a brick wall. His eyes darted to Vivian and then back to me. A flicker of unease crossed his face, but his ego quickly suppressed it. He let out a loud, forced laugh and turned his attention back to his wineglass, waving his hand as if dismissing a stubborn child. He thought he had won the exchange. He thought he had successfully reinforced his status at the top of the family hierarchy. He did not realize I was simply letting him enjoy his final meal. I reached into my coat pocket and rested my fingers against the cool brass of my grandmother's appraisal loop. The first course was cleared away. The trap was armed. Vivian stood up from her chair and walked toward the antique credenza to retrieve the heirloom silver. The real show was about to begin. The heavy oak doors of the dining room swung open, and the crowd of relatives filtered in. The space was a master class in calculated intimidation. A vast mahogany table stretched across the center of the room, polished to a mirror shine. Tall taper candles in crystal holders cast a flickering glow over the fine bone china. The scent of roasted rosemary and rich dark gravy filled the air. It was a setting designed to make you feel small. It was designed to remind you who held the power and who relied on their scraps. I found my place card at the very edge of the room. The geography of a family gathering is never an accident. It is a deliberate map of the social hierarchy. Uncle Richard and Cousin Ashley occupied the center seats of honor, flanked by the wealthiest of the extended relatives. Aunt Vivian sat at the head nearest the kitchen, acting as the conductor of the evening. My designated chair was shoved into the far corner. It sat unevenly on the edge of an expensive Persian rug. A cold draft leaked through the ancient window pane, chilling my left shoulder. To my right sat a high chair. A distant cousin's toddler was already smearing mashed sweet potatoes onto the pristine white linen. I sat down and smoothed my napkin over my lap. I did not complain about the draft. I did not ask to be moved. I accepted my position on the geographic fringe, because the periphery is the only place where you can see the entire board. The hired servers began pouring a dark, robust Cabernet into the oversized wine glasses. Richard took a long, eager swallow before the server even finished pouring. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and leaned back in his carved wooden chair. The alcohol acted as a fast-acting solvent on his nerves. The man who had been sweating in the foyer while dodging a commercial debt collector was suddenly replaced by the booming, confident patriarch. He held court over the first course. He gestured with his silver fork as he regaled the table with tales of his commercial real estate empire. He spun a narrative about a multi-million-dollar acquisition in the Seaport District. He bragged about outsmarting rival developers and securing prime waterfront zoning. The older aunts nodded in awe. Ashley smiled her practiced golden child smile, absorbing her father's fabricated glory as her own. The dramatic irony of the moment was thick enough to choke on. I sat quietly in my drafty corner, cutting a small piece of turkey. I did not look at his expensive watch or his tailored sweater. I looked at the man underneath. I knew the Seaport deal had collapsed 6 months ago. The spreadsheets I had audited in my Boston high-rise proved his anchor investors pulled out after discovering gross mismanagement of funds. I knew his liquidity was entirely gone. The man bragging about waterfront acquisitions was functionally bankrupt and drowning in margin calls. He was a hollow shell painted gold. When a liar feels the walls closing in, they will inevitably seek out a weaker target to divert the room's attention. Richard needed a scapegoat to solidify his illusion of dominance. He looked down the length of the long table. His eyes locked on to me. The bustling conversation among the relatives began to quiet down as they sensed the shift in his focus. "So, Gianna," he called out. His voice was pitched loud, ensuring every person in the room stopped chewing. "How is the city treating you? Are you still surviving on that little bookkeeping gig?" The condescension in the word surviving was precise. He wanted to paint a picture of me scraping pennies together in a cramped apartment. He wanted the room to feel pity for me so they could feel admiration for him. I set my knife down on the edge of my porcelain plate. The clink of the metal was soft but distinct. I looked back at him across the expanse of candles and crystal. "I am doing well, Richard," I replied. My voice was a flat, calm surface. He chuckled. It was a low, patronizing sound that grated against the quiet room. "You do not have to put on a brave face for us, Gianna. We are family. We know rent in Boston is getting steeper every month. It is tough for clerical workers out there." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He adopted the tone of a benevolent savior. "I was looking at my firm's payroll projections last week. We are expanding our administrative offices. I could probably find a spot for you as a junior desk assistant. The starting pay is modest, but it beats whatever freelance ledger work you are doing right now. It would give you some stability." The silence in the dining room swelled. A few aunts exchanged sympathetic glances. The toddler next to me threw a handful of sweet potatoes onto the floor, but no one noticed. They were all waiting for my reaction. They expected me to flush bright red. They expected me to lower my gaze and stammer a quiet, humiliating thank you for his insulting charity. I felt the cold brass of the silver appraisal loop resting in my coat pocket, draped over the back of my chair. I thought about the $14,000 Richard had shoved into his pocket 3 days ago. I thought about the stolen heirloom silver funding the very wine he was drinking. I was a senior forensic accountant who managed corporate fraud investigations worth tens of millions of dollars. I earned triple his fabricated salary. I held the power to send him to federal prison. Instead of defending my career, I picked up my water glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The ice clinked against the rim. I set the glass back down. "I appreciate the thought, Richard," I said, keeping my tone clinically detached. "But my current position provides more than enough stability. You should focus your resources on your own firm's internal ledger." Richard froze. The booming patriarch routine stalled. My lack of defensiveness threw him entirely off balance. He expected a flustered victim retreating into a shell. He got a brick wall. His eyes darted to Vivian and then back to me. A flicker of genuine unease crossed his features. The muscle in his jaw twitched. He realized his strike had failed to draw blood, but he could not figure out why. Ashley sensed her father's faltering momentum. She jumped in to protect the facade. She adjusted the cubic zirconia pendant resting on her collarbone and let out a sharp, dramatic sigh. "You are always so stubborn, Gianna," Ashley said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Dad is trying to throw you a lifeline, and your pride just will not let you take it. There is no shame in admitting you need financial help. It is better than pretending everything is fine when you are obviously struggling. The projection was a masterpiece of psychological deflection. The daughter of a bankrupt thief was accusing a forensic accountant of hiding financial ruin. I looked at Ashley. I noted the slight tremor in her hands as she gripped her napkin. She relied entirely on Richard's money to fund her upcoming wedding and her designer lifestyle. She was fiercely defending a fortress built on quicksand. I smiled. It was a small, polite smile that offered zero warmth. "We all manage our resources the best we can, Ashley," I replied. Richard let out a loud, forced laugh, waving his hand in the air to dismiss the tension. "Suit yourself," he boomed, picking up his wine glass again. "You cannot help someone who refuses to be helped." He took another deep drink. He thought he had won the exchange. He thought he had successfully reinforced his status at the top of the hierarchy. He believed his secrets were buried deep beneath his tailored cashmere and his empty boasts. He did not realize I was simply letting him enjoy his final meal. You do not interrupt an adversary when they are actively constructing their own trap. You just sit back and watch them dig the hole deeper. The servers moved through the room, clearing the salad plates and preparing for the main course. The tension simmered beneath the polite chatter of the extended relatives. I sat in my drafty corner, letting the cold air sharpen my focus. The quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded like a countdown. Aunt Vivian pushed her chair back and stood up. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the rim of her crystal wine glass. A sharp ringing noise cut through the dining room, commanding immediate silence. She smoothed the front of her silk blouse and offered the table a radiant, artificial smile. "Before we bring out the turkey," Vivian announced, her voice echoing off the wainscoting, "I want to continue our most cherished tradition. It is time to set the table with my mother's heirloom silver gravy boat." She turned her back to the guests and walked gracefully toward the antique mahogany credenza resting against the far wall. The real performance was about to begin. The trap was armed, and Uncle Richard was about to find out exactly what happens when you try to sell silver-plated lies to someone who checks the hallmark. The sharp ringing of Aunt Vivian's fingernail against her crystal wine glass cut through the low hum of conversation. The hired servers paused their movements, hovering near the swinging kitchen doors. The extended relatives shifted in their heavy wooden chairs, turning their attention toward the head of the table. Vivian stood tall, her silk blouse catching the candlelight. She smoothed the front of her skirt with both hands. It was a gesture designed to demand absolute focus. Before the servers carved the turkey, Vivian announced, her voice carrying a practiced melodic tone. "I want to observe our most sacred family tradition. It is time to set the table with my mother's heirloom silver." She turned her back on the dining room and walked toward the antique mahogany credenza that anchored the far wall. The credenza was a heavy, ornate piece of furniture. It held a polished wooden box lined with deep green velvet. The box was supposed to contain the centerpiece of Beatrice's legacy: the ornate gravy boat, the heavy serving platters, and the intricate slotted spoons, pieces that had survived decades of holidays, pieces that carried the weight of our family history. Vivian reached out and unlatched the small brass clasp on the front of the box. She lifted the heavy wooden lid. For a single, agonizing second, the room was perfectly quiet. Then Vivian let out a sound that shattered the silence. It was not a word. It was a sharp, breathless shriek, a high-pitched intake of air that bordered on theatrical hysteria. She stumbled backward. Her hands flew to her mouth. Her manicured nails dug into her own cheeks. "It is gone," she gasped. Her voice trembled violently. "It is all gone." The dining room erupted. The polite veneer of the holiday dinner vanished instantly. Chairs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. Several aunts gasped, clutching their napkins to their chests. Cousins began talking over one another, their voices rising in a panicked, chaotic crescendo. The red herring of the missing serving spoon from an hour earlier dissolved entirely. This was no longer a misplaced utensil. This was a massive, high-stakes theft executed inside a gated estate. Uncle Richard jumped up from his center seat so fast his chair nearly tipped backward. He slammed his hands flat onto the dining table. "What do you mean it is gone?" Richard bellowed. His voice was a booming, aggressive roar designed to dominate the panic. "What the hell is going on, Vivian?" He stormed past the seated guests, shoving a server out of his path. He reached the credenza and stared down into the open, velvet-lined box. It was completely empty. The green fabric was pristine, bearing only the faint indentations where the heavy silver pieces had rested for years. Richard spun around to face the dining room. His face was contorted into a mask of pure fury. "Who was in the hallway?" he demanded. "Who has been near this credenza? I want every single catering staff member brought out here immediately. No one leaves this house. I am calling the police." I sat in my drafty corner chair. I did not gasp. I did not stand up. I did not join the chorus of panicked voices. I picked up my silver fork and my knife. I slowly cut a small piece of roasted turkey. The meat was dry, but I chewed it methodically. I kept my eyes locked on Richard. My forensic training kicked in, overriding the chaos of the room. When you investigate corporate fraud, you learn to ignore what a suspect says. You watch what their body does. You study the micro-expressions that betray the lie before the brain can fully construct it. Richard was performing the role of an outraged patriarch. He was playing the part of a man who had just been robbed. But his performance was fundamentally flawed. It was a bad, overacted script. When a person experiences genuine shock, their physical reaction is immediate and involuntary. The eyes widen, the breath catches, the focus locks onto the source of the shock. But Richard's reaction was a beat too slow. He had waited for Vivian to scream before he stood up. He had paused to slam his hands on the table, a calculated, dramatic pause before rushing to the credenza. More importantly, I watched his eyes. When he stared down into the empty velvet box, his gaze did not linger on the missing items. His eyes darted nervously over his shoulder toward the heavy oak front doors of the house. He was not looking for the missing silver. He was looking for an escape route. He was scanning the perimeter because he knew the threat was not outside the house. The threat was inside his own head. He knew exactly where the silver was because he had sold it 3 days ago to a money launderer in the Back Bay. He had shoved the $14,000 into his tailored coat pocket to stave off a commercial debt collection agency. His booming voice, his aggressive posturing, his threat to call the police, it was all a desperate smokescreen. He needed the room to be chaotic. He needed the relatives to panic, because panic blinds people to the truth. Vivian collapsed into a nearby chair, sobbing loudly into her hands. "How could this happen?" she wailed. "My mother's legacy. Someone came into our home and desecrated her memory." Ashley rushed to her mother's side, kneeling on the Persian rug. She wrapped her arms around Vivian, shooting venomous glares at the hired servers, who were now huddled near the kitchen doors, looking terrified. "Dad is right," Ashley announced, her voice trembling with manufactured rage. "It had to be the catering staff. They were the only strangers in the house. We need to search their bags. We need to check their cars before they try to drive away." Richard paced the length of the dining room, running his hands through his thinning hair. His performance was shifting from outrage to frantic deflection. He needed a target. He needed to point the finger at someone vulnerable before anyone started asking logical questions. Before anyone realized the estate was gated, the doors were locked, and the catering staff had been supervised the entire afternoon. I set my fork down on my plate. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the cold brass of my grandmother's appraisal loop. I rubbed my thumb over the glass lens. I watched the frantic energy of the room swirl around me. The relatives were caught in a vicious echo chamber, feeding off Vivian's hysteria and Richard's aggressive deflection. The mystery was no longer about who stole the silver. The mystery had shifted entirely. The question now was who Richard and Ashley would choose as their sacrificial lamb. Who would they offer up to the firing squad to protect their bankrupt facade? I knew the answer before the accusation was even spoken. A sinking, icy realization settled in my stomach. The catering staff was an easy target, but they were outside the family hierarchy. Blaming them would invite a police investigation. It would invite detectives asking questions. It would invite a forensic look into the estate's finances. Richard could not risk the police knocking on his door. He needed a target he could control. He needed a target the family already disliked. He needed someone the relatives would eagerly tear apart without asking for proof. Ashley stood up from the floor. She smoothed her silk dress and turned to face the dining room. Her tear-filled eyes scanned the faces of the extended family. Then her gaze slowly, deliberately drifted past the center of the table. She looked past the wealthy aunts and the nervous uncles. Her eyes locked onto me. She stared directly at the drafty corner where I sat quietly cutting my dry turkey. A slow, calculating stillness settled over her features. The fake tears vanished, replaced by a cold, predatory focus. The dining room began to quiet down as the relatives noticed Ashley's fixed stare. One by one, the heads turned. The chaotic shouting faded into a tense, suffocating silence. The trap had officially sprung, and Cousin Ashley was about to provide the spark that would burn the entire holiday down to the ground. The sudden quiet in the dining room felt heavier than the panic. A moment earlier, the space had been a turbulent sea of shouting relatives and scraping chairs. Now the energy funneled into a single, narrow beam. Ashley stood near her weeping mother. Her eyes remained locked on my drafty corner of the table. She did not point a finger. She did not raise her voice. Ashley possessed a dangerous talent for weaponizing vulnerability. She knew a loud accusation would make her look vindictive. A soft, reluctant confession, however, would make her look like a hero. "Mom, wait," Ashley said. Her voice was a fragile tremor. She placed a delicate hand on Vivian's shoulder. Vivian looked up, her mascara slightly smudged beneath her lower lashes. "What is it, Ashley? Did you see something?" Ashley bit her bottom lip. She performed a masterful pantomime of internal conflict. She looked down at the Persian rug, then glanced back at me with wide, sorrowful eyes. I did not want to say anything Ashley murmured loud enough for the entire room to hear. I thought maybe I was just overthinking it, but when Gianna first got here this afternoon before she put those pies in the garage, she paused, letting the suspense hang in the air. Richard stopped pacing. The distant aunts leaned forward in their carved wooden chairs. The catering staff stood frozen by the kitchen doors, grateful the crosshairs had shifted away from them. She was standing by the credenza. Ashley continued, her voice barely above a whisper, just lingering there. Her big leather tote bag was unzipped. I thought she was just admiring the mahogany finish, but she stayed there for a long time before taking her coat off. I asked her what she was doing, and she jumped. She looked so startled. It was a brilliant piece of fiction. The best lies always incorporate fragments of the truth to anchor the deception. I had been standing in the hallway when I arrived. I was holding my heavy leather bag. But I was not looking at the credenza. I had been standing in the shadow of the staircase, observing Uncle Richard reject a call from a commercial debt collector. Ashley took those real props and rearranged them into a counterfeit narrative. She provided her mother with the exact ammunition she needed while keeping her own hands pristine. I watched Uncle Richard. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. The rigid panic gripping his shoulders dissolved. He exhaled a long, slow breath through his nose. He knew his daughter was lying. He knew I had not stolen the heirloom silver, because the $14,000 he received for fencing it was currently sitting in his own bank account. Yet he did not step forward to correct the record. He stood there, letting his child feed me to the wolves to buy himself a temporary reprieve. It was a cowardice so profound it bordered on breathtaking. The collective gaze of 20 extended family members turned toward my corner of the long table. The shift in the room was visceral. You could feel the judgment settling over the china plates and the crystal wine glasses. Growing up in this family taught me early on that truth is rarely a defense against a preferred narrative. When we were teenagers, Ashley once backed Richard's luxury sedan into a stone retaining wall. She walked into the house crying and told her parents I had distracted her by yelling. Richard paid for the repairs, and Vivian grounded me for a month. I spent hours defending myself, pleading my innocence. The more I fought, the more they nodded with grim satisfaction. To them, my frustration was evidence of my guilt. I learned back then that arguing with an irrational mob only feeds their hunger. It validates their premise. If you scream, you are unstable. If you cry, you are manipulative. If you defend yourself, you are guilty. So I did none of those things. I set my silver fork down on the edge of my porcelain plate. I placed the knife perfectly parallel beside it. I picked up my white linen napkin, dabbed the corners of my mouth, and folded it neatly into a square. I placed the folded linen on the table. Then I rested my hands in my lap. I kept my spine straight. I looked directly at Ashley. I did not blink. I offered zero reaction. The silence stretched taut. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending a shower of orange sparks up the stone chimney. The toddler in the high chair beside me dropped a plastic toy onto the hardwood floor with a sharp clatter. No one moved to pick it up. My silence unsettled them. They had anticipated a frantic denial. They expected me to jump out of my chair and stammer about my innocence. They wanted a show. A panicked reaction would have given them a rope to grab onto, a thread they could pull to unravel me further. By offering them nothing, I forced them to sit in the uncomfortable void of their own creation. I analyzed the room through the lens of a forensic investigator. When you audit a fraudulent company, the employees often exhibit a specific herd mentality. They align themselves with the leadership out of self-preservation. The family was operating on the exact same psychological principle. Aunt Margaret, a woman who had not spoken 2 words to me all evening, squinted her eyes, narrowing them into suspicious slits. Uncle Arthur shook his head slowly, letting out a disappointed sigh. They wanted it to be me. If the thief was a random caterer, it was a tragedy that proved the world was dangerous. But if the thief was the quiet, isolated niece who lived in a cramped city apartment, it confirmed their pre-existing biases. It made them feel superior. It protected their worldview. My lack of a defense acted like a mirror, reflecting their toxic prejudice back at them. The longer I sat there without speaking, the heavier the air became. Ashley shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her confidence faltering under my unblinking stare. She opened her mouth to add another detail to her fabricated story, but closed it again, unsure of how to navigate the dead air. Vivian processed her daughter's lie. I watched the realization dawn on her face. The grief over the missing silver was instantly overshadowed by the intoxicating rush of righteous anger. She had found her target. She no longer had to feel like a victim. She could be the executioner. Vivian wiped the smudged makeup from her cheeks. Her posture stiffened. She stepped away from the empty mahogany credenza and walked slowly toward the center of the dining room. She bypassed Richard, pushing past the empty chairs of the stunned guests. The tension in the room wound tight like a coiled spring. The silence was no longer empty. It was pressurized. Every person in the room held their breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. I sat in my drafty corner, feeling the cold brass of the appraisal loop resting in my pocket. I watched Vivian march toward me, her eyes burning with a fierce, unyielding certainty. The spark had caught the powder. The detonation was only a few steps away. Aunt Vivian marched across the Persian rug with the rigid purpose of an executioner. Her silk blouse caught the flickering light of the chandelier. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. The timeline of the evening circled back and locked perfectly into place. We had arrived at the exact moment this Thanksgiving dinner shattered. Vivian stopped a few inches from my drafty corner of the table. She raised her right hand. Her manicured index finger trembled as she aimed it directly at my face. The diamond cluster on her wedding ring flashed a sharp, blinding reflection. "Empty your purse, Gianna," she commanded. Her voice was a strained, harsh whisper meant to cut through the hushed dining room. "And hand Richard your car keys. We know you took it." I looked up at her flushed face. I felt the familiar, suffocating weight of being the designated villain. For 15 years, this family had constructed a false narrative about my character. They painted me as the struggling niece, the bitter outsider, the financial failure who harbored deep jealousy toward her privileged relatives. It did not matter that I left for Boston a decade ago and built an untouchable career. In their minds, I was permanently frozen as the desperate 20-something who once asked for a modest student loan and was publicly denied. My leather tote bag rested on the floor beside my boots. I did not reach for it. I did not pull out my keys. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. The silence that followed Vivian's demand was brief. It was quickly filled by the collective murmur of the extended relatives. A psychological phenomenon happens when a group of people are presented with a convenient scapegoat. They abandon individual logic and merge into a single, toxic organism. They become an echo chamber, reinforcing each other's biases to protect the comfort of the herd. Aunt Helen sat 3 chairs down from Vivian. Helen was a woman whose entire personality revolved around country club gossip. She leaned toward the center of the table and muttered under her breath. But she spoke just loud enough for everyone to catch the syllables. She was always a troubled girl, Helen whispered, shaking her head with performative sorrow. Remember when she was 17 and that designer jacket went missing from the coat room? The jacket had been found 3 days later under Cousin Derek's bed, but Helen conveniently omitted that fact. The truth was irrelevant. The label had stuck. Troubled, unstable, untrustworthy. Derek sat across from Helen, swirling his wine. He inherited his father's arrogant sneer. He leaned forward and added his own venom to the growing fire. "City rent is no joke," Derek chimed in. His tone dripped with smug superiority. "And those credit card bills pile up fast. You take a few antique serving trays to a pawn shop downtown, and nobody asks any questions. It is a quick cash grab." The chorus of murmurs grew louder. Other relatives nodded in solemn agreement. A chorus of quiet condemnations echoed off the wainscoting. They were assembling a makeshift tribunal right in the middle of the holiday dinner. They were acting as judge and jury based on a fictional premise they had invented out of thin air. I listened to them with icy detachment. As a forensic accountant, I spent my life studying the anatomy of a lie. The most dangerous frauds are never perpetrated by a single person. They require complicity. They require a boardroom, or in this case, a dining room, full of people willing to look the other way because confronting the truth would disrupt the established order. This family needed me to be a thief. If I was the criminal, then Richard was still the successful patriarch. Ashley was still the golden child. Vivian was still the flawless matriarch. Expelling me was the necessary price to keep their hollow fortress standing. I allowed them to build their trap. I let them stack the bricks of their false accusations as high as they possibly could. I wanted the walls to be insurmountable. The taller the structure, the more devastating the collapse would be. I shifted my gaze away from Vivian and looked down the length of the mahogany table. I found Uncle Richard. He was sitting in his carved wooden chair, but he looked as though he was shrinking. His earlier booming confidence had evaporated. The man who had demanded a search of the catering staff was now entirely mute. A thick layer of perspiration coated his forehead, reflecting the candlelight. His complexion had turned a sickly ashen gray. Richard refused to meet my eyes. He stared intensely at his half-empty wineglass. His knuckles were bone white where he gripped the stem. He was watching his wife and his daughter publicly crucify his niece for a felony he had committed. He knew the $14,000 he received for the heirloom silver was sitting in his business account. He knew the money launderer in the Back Bay held the velvet box. Yet he remained silent. His cowardice was a tangible living thing in the room. He was a spectator to his own crime, willing to let an innocent woman burn at the stake just to delay his own execution by a few more hours. Vivian grew impatient with my silence. She slammed her hand down on the edge of the table, rattling the bone china plates. "Did you hear me, Gianna?" she demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "Stop sitting there staring at us like a sociopath. Give me the bag. If you have nothing to hide, you will let us search your things. Do not make me call the authorities and ruin this holiday for everyone." The threat of the police was the ultimate bluff. She assumed the mere mention of law enforcement would break my resolve and force a tearful confession. She assumed I was terrified of being exposed. I unclasped my hands. I placed my palms flat against the pristine white linen tablecloth. I felt the cold draft from the window behind me, but my internal temperature was much colder. I did not feel fear. I felt the surgical precision of an investigator ready to close a case. I looked up at Vivian. I met her furious, burning gaze with absolute, unblinking stillness. I let 5 long seconds pass, allowing the room to grow agonizingly quiet. The distant chatter of the aunts ceased. Derek stopped swirling his wine. Richard squeezed his eyes shut. I tilted my head a fraction of an inch. I kept my voice incredibly soft, forcing Vivian to lean forward just to hear me. "Are you certain you want to do this right now, Vivian?" It was a clinical question. It was devoid of anger or panic. It was the tone of a surgeon asking for a scalpel before making the first critical incision. Vivian faltered for a microsecond. The utter lack of fear in my voice confused her, but her ego pushed her forward. She was too committed to the narrative to back down in front of an audience. She braced her hands against the table and prepared to deliver her final, fatal demand. The echo chamber had spoken, but they were about to realize they had brought a knife to a gunfight. Vivian narrowed her eyes. She interpreted my calm demeanor as insolence, her jaw set into a hard, rigid line. The faint hesitation that had flickered across her face vanished, swallowed instantly by her towering ego. She was standing in front of 20 relatives. She had already drawn her weapon. She could not retreat without sacrificing her pride. "Do not play psychological games with me, Gianna," she snapped. She extended her left hand, palm facing upward in a demanding gesture. "I am not asking you again. Give me your keys. Give me the bag. If you refuse, I will have Arthur call the police and we will let them search your vehicle in the driveway." Her threat hung over the dining table. The extended family leaned in. They were ready for the climax of the show. They expected me to burst into tears. They anticipated a frantic, desperate apology or a sudden dash for the front door. They wanted the chaotic, messy breakdown of a guilty thief caught in the act. I placed my hands on the wooden edge of my chair. I pushed backward. The legs of the chair scraped against the hardwood floor with a sharp, grating sound. The noise startled the toddler sitting in the high chair beside me. He stopped dropping his toys and stared. I stood up. My movements were slow, measured, and entirely devoid of urgency. I smoothed the hem of my beige sweater. I rolled my shoulders back, standing to my full height. I am not an imposing figure, but posture dictates presence. When you control your breathing and strip every ounce of fear from your body, you alter the gravity of a room. I did not look at Vivian. I bypassed the woman pointing the finger and shifted my focus straight down the center of the long mahogany table. I locked my eyes directly onto Uncle Richard. He was still gripping his wine glass. His knuckles were pale. He looked like a man standing on a trap door waiting for the lever to pull. "I am not a bookkeeper, Richard," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried a crisp, metallic edge. It sliced through the heavy scent of roasted sage and melted candle wax. Richard blinked. His brow furrowed in confusion. The sudden pivot away from the stolen silver threw the room off balance. Aunt Helen tilted her head, exchanging a bewildered glance with Cousin Derek. They did not understand why the accused thief was suddenly talking about her employment history. I do not file receipts for a paper supply company. I continued keeping my gaze pinned to my uncle. I do not do freelance clerical work to scrape by on rent. I allowed you to tell this family that story because it was convenient for me. It kept you complacent. It kept you talking. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His throat worked a dry swallow. "I am a senior forensic accountant," I said. The title landed on the pristine white tablecloth like a lead weight. I manage the financial investigations division for a top-tier firm in downtown Boston. The dining room went eerily still. The aunts and uncles who had just been whispering about pawn shops and credit card debt suddenly found themselves adrift in unfamiliar territory. The vocabulary of the room had shifted. We were no longer participating in a hysterical family drama over a missing gravy boat. We had just entered the chilling clinical reality of a legal deposition. You see, Richard I took a slow, deliberate step away from my drafty corner chair. Forensic accounting is not about balancing modest budgets. It is the architecture of consequence. My team dismantles offshore shell companies. We trace hidden assets during high-net-worth divorce settlements. We run compliance audits on commercial real estate developers suspected of defrauding their investors. We hunt the money that desperate people try to bury in the dark. The blood drained from Richard's face. The transformation was rapid and terrifying to witness. The ashen gray of his skin turned a pale, sickly white. The booming patriarch who had bragged about waterfront acquisitions was gone. In his place sat a hollow, terrified man who realized he had just invited a predator into his home and handed her a map to his deepest secrets. Vivian lowered her outstretched hand. Her demanding posture faltered. She looked from me to her husband and back again. She did not understand the undercurrent of the conversation. She was still trapped in her own petty narrative. "What are you talking about?" Vivian interrupted, her voice wavering. "What does your job have to do with my mother's silver? Stop changing the subject." I kept my eyes on Richard. I ignored Vivian entirely. A month ago, I said, my tone dropping into a steady, rhythmic cadence, a man named Harrison walked into my office in the city. You remember Harrison, do you not, Richard? He is the estate attorney, the man tasked with managing Grandmother Beatrice's lingering trust. Richard flinched. The wine glass in his hand trembled, spilling a few drops of dark red liquid onto the pristine linen cloth. The stain bloomed like a tiny bruise. Harrison was deeply concerned. I continued stepping closer to the center of the room. As the executor of the estate, Richard, you had a fiduciary duty to distribute the assets according to the law. But you missed the initial probate filing. Then you missed the extension deadline. You dodged Harrison's phone calls. You claimed the estate assets were tied up in complex appraisals and unyielding red tape. Harrison suspected you were stalling, but he lacked the specialized tools to pierce the veil of your corporate limited liability companies. The silence in the dining room was absolute. Cousin Ashley sat frozen, her mouth slightly open. The cubic zirconia pendant rested motionless against her collarbone. She looked at her father, waiting for him to boom his deep laugh and dismiss the accusations. She waited for him to call me crazy. She waited for the invincible wall of his wealth to protect her. He said nothing. He stared at his plate. A single drop of sweat rolled down his temple and caught in his collar. "So Harrison hired my firm," I said. I took the case off the books. I spent the last 3 weeks conducting a silent, comprehensive audit of your commercial real estate ventures. I traced the wire transfers. I audited the ghost accounts. I read the termination notices from your anchor tenants. I know exactly how much debt you carry, Richard, and I know the desperate lengths you went to this week to avoid a catastrophic margin call. The dynamic in the room had inverted entirely. The mob mentality of the extended family evaporated. The aunts and cousins shrank back into their carved wooden chairs. They recognized the tone of my voice. It was the tone of undeniable authority. It was the sound of a trap snapping shut. They had spent 15 years treating me like a stray dog begging for scraps. Now they realized I was the one holding the leash. Vivian took a step toward me. The fierce, unyielding certainty in her eyes had been replaced by a frantic, darting panic. The ground beneath her feet was dissolving, and she could not figure out how to stop it. "Gianna," she said, her voice thin and reedy, "I do not care about Harrison. I do not care about your accounting firm. You are trying to confuse us. You were standing by the credenza. Ashley saw you. You took the velvet box. Open your bag." I finally turned to look at my aunt. I felt a fleeting trace of pity for her. She had built her entire identity around the success of her husband. She wore his fabricated wealth like a suit of armor. She had no idea the armor was made of paper. "I will not be opening my purse, Vivian," I said. My voice was gentle, but unbending. "I do not need to empty my bag to prove my innocence. "Why not?" she demanded, her pitch rising into a shrill note. "Because I already know exactly where the heirloom silver is," I replied. "I know exactly what time it left this house, I know exactly how much it sold for, and I know the name of the man who sold it." I reached down and picked up my leather tote bag from the hardwood floor. The heavy brass clasp jingled softly in the quiet room. I unzipped the top compartment. The audience of relatives leaned forward, their eyes wide with morbid anticipation. The truth was armed. It was aimed. And it was time to pull the trigger. I reached my hand into the dark interior of my leather tote bag. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint friction of my wool sleeve brushing against the brass zipper. I bypassed my wallet. I bypassed my car keys. My fingers searched the bottom of the bag until they found the smooth, heavy stock paper waiting there. I pulled the object out into the warm chandelier light. It was a crisp white envelope. Embossed in the upper left corner was a silver crest belonging to a luxury antique dealer located on Newbury Street. It was a shop known to the quiet circles of Boston elites who required swift discretion more than they required a fair appraisal. I held the envelope between my thumb and index finger. I did not stand up to hand it to Vivian. I did not walk around the table. I set the pristine paper flat on the polished mahogany surface. I gave it a firm, deliberate push. The thick envelope glided across the smooth wood. It bypassed the crystal wine glasses. It slid past the roasted turkey and the bowls of untouched side dishes. It came to a perfect halt, exactly 1 inch from the edge of Vivian's porcelain dinner plate. Vivian stared down at it. For a fraction of a second, her ingrained superiority held firm. She assumed it was a pawnshop ticket. She assumed it was my written confession or a desperate plea for forgiveness. Her lips curled into a tight, triumphant sneer. She reached out with her manicured fingers and snatched the envelope off the table. "The heirloom collection is not in the trunk of my car, Vivian," I said. My voice remained at a steady conversational volume, forcing the distant relatives to strain their ears to hear me. "The silver was sold on Tuesday afternoon," I continued. "It was appraised at $30,000, but the seller was in a profound hurry. He accepted a rushed cash buyout of $14,000. Vivian stopped tearing at the flap. The sneer on her face faltered. $14,000 was not a number associated with a quick credit card fix or a missed rent payment. It was a substantial sum of liquid cash. Her hands hesitated. She pulled the folded document from the envelope. It was a detailed, itemized bill of sale. In my line of work, you learn that thieves rarely steal for the thrill of luxury. They steal to plug a hole in a sinking ship. My grandmother Beatrice had spent a lifetime collecting those ornate serving trays and slotted spoons. She polished them every Sunday afternoon. She believed they would sit on this exact dining table long after she was gone. She never imagined her legacy would be traded away to cover a fraction of a commercial margin call by her own son. Vivian scanned the top of the page. Her eyes darted back and forth across the printed text. I watched the cognitive dissonance wage a fierce war behind her eyes. She read the detailed description of the items: the ornate gravy boat, the velvet-lined mahogany box, the exact match to her mother's cherished collection. "Read the bottom line, Vivian," I said. She did not look up. Her hands began to shake holding the crisp paper. The tremor traveled up her slender wrists and into her tense shoulders. The paper rattled softly in the quiet room. "Read the signature on the seller line," I instructed. My tone allowed zero room for negotiation. "Tell the table who signed away the silver." Vivian opened her mouth. Her lips parted, but she could not find her breath. She looked like a woman who had just stepped off a high ledge and was waiting for the ground to rush up to meet her. The protective fortress of her reality was crumbling beneath her designer shoes. "Who is it?" Vivian asked Aunt Helen, her voice tight with morbid curiosity. Vivian swallowed hard. The muscles in her neck strained. She lowered the paper a few inches. She turned her head slowly, shifting her gaze from the printed document to the man sitting in the center seat of honor. "Richard," she whispered. It was a fragile, broken sound. The name left her lips and drifted across the dining room like a ghost. The reaction was instantaneous. 20 heads snapped toward the middle of the table. Every set of eyes locked onto the patriarch. The extended relatives stared at the man who had spent the last hour projecting unyielding wealth, the man who had bragged about waterfront acquisitions and prime commercial zoning, the man who 10 minutes earlier had offered me a junior desk assistant job to help me pay my modest city rent. Richard sat frozen in his carved wooden chair. The grand performance was over. He did not puff out his chest. He did not unleash his booming laugh to dismiss the tension. He stared blankly at the white linen tablecloth. His right hand was still wrapped around the stem of his crystal wine glass. He gripped the fragile glass with such terrifying force, I expected it to shatter and slice his palm open. His knuckles were bone white, lacking all blood circulation. A single drop of sweat rolled down his temple and soaked into his cashmere collar. The echo chamber collapsed. Cousin Derek sat back in his chair, his mouth hanging slightly open. Aunt Helen covered her face with both hands, dropping her previous gossip instantly. The collective illusion they had all participated in was fracturing in real time. They had been so eager to condemn the quiet niece in the drafty corner. They had been so willing to execute the designated scapegoat to protect their comfortable worldview. Now they were forced to look at the rot festering at the very center of their own family tree. I sat perfectly still, observing the destruction. The satisfaction of irrefutable documentation is a cold, clean feeling. An emotional lie can be debated. A verbal accusation can be deflected or turned around. But a notarized bill of sale bearing a matching signature leaves no room for creative interpretation. It is a locked door with no key. Forensic accounting strips away the noise. Math has no emotion. Ink does not care about your country club membership or the brand of your luxury SUV. When the ledger zeroes out, the truth is the only thing left standing on the page. Richard knew he was cornered. He knew the antique dealer had surrendered the paperwork to the auditor. But the human ego is a stubborn parasite. It will fight for survival long after the host is functionally dead. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice failed him. He looked at his wife and saw the horror in her eyes. He looked at the relatives and saw their judgment shifting toward him like a tidal wave. Ashley sat next to her father. She looked at his pale, sweating face. She looked at the receipt trembling in her mother's hand. The golden child could not process the sudden downfall of her provider. Her upcoming wedding, her designer wardrobe, her entire identity relied on the money Richard supplied. She could not afford for him to be a thief. She reached out and snatched the paper from Vivian. Her eyes scanned the signature. The denial was about to mutate into something much louder, and the next phase of the trap was ready to spring. The crisp white envelope rested on the table, but Ashley refused to leave it alone. She snatched the receipt from her mother's trembling fingers. Her manicured nails dug into the thick paper, leaving deep crescent indentations near the embossed crest. Her chest heaved. The cubic zirconia pendant resting against her collarbone caught the chandelier light, trembling with her rapid heartbeat. In the world of forensic accounting, you encounter a specific type of psychological defense. When a corrupt executive is presented with a ledger proving their embezzlement, they do not immediately confess. Their brain erects a temporary firewall. They reject the empirical data to protect their self-image. Ashley was executing this exact mechanism. She was staring at a notarized document, but her mind refused to translate the ink into reality. Her upcoming wedding, her designer dresses, her entire social standing in Concord relied on the myth of her father's wealth. If Richard was a common thief, then Ashley was the daughter of a destitute criminal. The cognitive dissonance was too painful to absorb, so she invented a new reality on the spot. "This is fake," Ashley declared. Her voice was sharp and brittle, echoing off the wainscoting. She looked up from the receipt and aimed a fierce glare across the dining room. She waved the crumpled paper in the air. "You printed this yourself, Gianna," she shouted. "You typed this up on your computer because you knew we would catch you stealing. You are trying to frame my father to cover up your own mess." Vivian seized the lifeline instantly. The matriarch was drowning in humiliation, and her daughter had just thrown her a raft. Vivian did not care if the raft was made of paper. She grabbed onto the forgery theory with terrifying speed. Of course, Vivian gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. Her previous horror evaporated, replaced by a renewed, burning rage. Of course it is a fake. Look at her, standing there. She has always been jealous of us. She is a vindictive sociopath. She stole my mother's silver, and now she is trying to destroy my husband's reputation to save her own skin. The extended relatives sitting around the long mahogany table shifted uncomfortably. Aunt Helen and Cousin Derek exchanged uneasy glances. A few moments ago, the mob had been united. Now the narrative was splitting. A fabricated receipt felt like a stretch even for a family accustomed to intense mental gymnastics. But Vivian and Ashley were the hosts. The relatives remained quiet, waiting to see which side of the battlefield would hold firm. I stood near my drafty corner chair. I did not raise my voice to defend the authenticity of the document. I did not point out the embossed watermark or the distinct ink signature. I simply shifted my gaze to Uncle Richard. If the document was a crude forgery, the patriarch should have been the first person to tear it apart. A truly innocent man falsely accused of a felony by his niece would erupt in righteous fury. He would demand to see the paper. He would laugh at the pathetic attempt to frame him. He would order me out of his house. Richard did none of those things. The stem of his crystal wineglass finally slipped from his pale, slick fingers. The heavy glass tipped over. It struck the edge of his porcelain dinner plate with a sharp clatter. The dark red wine spilled across the pristine white linen tablecloth. The stain spread rapidly, soaking into the expensive fabric like a fresh wound. Richard did not reach for a napkin. He did not attempt to stop the spill. He slowly placed both of his hands flat on the edge of the table. He pushed himself up from his carved wooden chair. His knees trembled. His imposing frame seemed to have shrunk by several inches. The tailored cashmere sweater hung loosely on his shoulders. "Ashley Vivian," he said. His voice was hollow. It lacked any trace of his former booming authority. "Stop talking, both of you." Ashley turned to him, her face flushed with defensive anger. "Dad, you do not have to protect her," she insisted. "We know she faked this. We are going to call the police and show them what she did." "Put the paper down," Ashley Richard commanded. His tone was not angry. It was saturated with sheer, suffocating dread. "Just put it down." He looked across the table at me. His eyes were wide and bloodshot. The arrogant facade had burned away entirely. He was looking at a predator who had somehow managed to sneak past all his defenses. He knew I had audited his limited liability companies. He knew I had visited the antique dealer on Newberry Street. He understood the terrifying reality of my profession. If I possessed the receipt, I possessed everything else, too. "Gianna," he stammered, taking a shaky breath. "Gianna, this is a profound misunderstanding. You are missing critical context. The estate finances are complicated. There are moving parts you do not fully grasp." He stepped away from his chair. He raised his hands in a placating gesture, palms facing outward. He was no longer playing to the audience of relatives. He was pleading directly with me. "Let us step away from the table," Richard said, his voice cracking on the last syllable. "Let us go into my study. We can close the doors and pour a drink. We can sit down like professionals and sort this out. I can explain the leverage situation. I can show you the internal ledgers. We do not need to do this out here." He was begging me with his eyes. The silent plea was unmistakable. He was asking me to spare him the ultimate humiliation. He was willing to negotiate a surrender behind closed doors if I would just allow him to keep his mask intact in front of his wife and his golden child. I looked at the terrified man standing amidst the spilled wine. I felt zero empathy. Empathy is a valuable resource. It should be reserved for those who are capable of returning it. For 15 years, this man had watched his wife and daughter isolate and degrade me. 10 minutes ago, he had weaponized my supposed poverty to elevate his own status. He had allowed his family to form a tribunal against me for a theft he committed. I remained standing, my posture perfectly straight. I kept my voice crisp and level, ensuring every single person in the room heard my response. "We are not going to the study," Richard I replied. He flinched as if I had struck him across the face. "Please, Gianna," he whispered, "do not do this." I tilted my head, studying his panic. 10 minutes ago, you demanded a public search of the catering staff, I pointed out. You were ready to empty their pockets in the foyer. 5 minutes ago, your wife demanded my car keys and threatened to have the police search my trunk in the driveway. You sat in that exact chair and allowed her to label me a criminal in front of 20 witnesses. I took a slow step forward, bridging the distance between the corner of the room and the center of the table. You did not want privacy when you thought I was the target, Richard, I continued. You wanted a spectacle. You wanted a public execution. You only want closed doors now because the gun is pointing in the opposite direction. Vivian stared at her husband. The sheer desperation in his voice was finally piercing through her thick layer of denial. "Richard," she said, her tone shifting from rage to deep confusion. "Richard, why are you asking her to go to the study? Tell them it is a fake. Tell them she is lying." Richard squeezed his eyes shut. He could not look at his wife. The silence in the dining room became agonizing. The juxtaposition was stark and relentless. Ashley was still clutching the receipt, vibrating with loud defensive energy, while her father stood paralyzed, crushed beneath the weight of a terrifying realization. Ashley waved the paper again, refusing to surrender the illusion. "He does not have to explain anything to you," she spat at me. "You printed a piece of paper. That proves nothing. Anyone can forge a signature. You have no real proof." The demand for proof is the final refuge of a cornered liar. They will dismiss paper as forgery. They will dismiss witnesses as biased. They require an undeniable sensory experience to finally break their cognitive firewall. I did not argue with my cousin. I did not debate the validity of the ink. I simply reached into the front pocket of my tailored trousers. The receipt was merely the opening argument. The trial was far from over. It was time to provide the undeniable sensory experience. It was time to show them the hallmark. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and unlocked the screen. The grand finale of my forensic audit was queued up and ready to play. Ashley gripped the edge of the dining table with one hand while waving the itemized bill of sale wildly with the other. Her knuckles matched the pristine white of the linen tablecloth. She refused to yield. The narrative she had constructed was the only raft keeping her above water. She clung to it with the ferocity of a drowning passenger thrashing against the inevitable current. "You printed this at home," she shrieked. Her voice bounced off the crystal glassware and the heavy chandelier. "You found the store logo online and typed my father's name at the bottom. It is a pathetic attempt to deflect from your own crime." A piece of paper proves absolutely nothing. Anyone with a basic computer can create a fake invoice. I did not argue with my cousin. Arguing validates the opponent's premise. I looked past her frantic performance and focused on the massive 85-inch smart television mounted on the wall directly behind Uncle Richard's chair. Aunt Vivian usually kept it displaying a digital slideshow of curated family vacation photos during her dinner parties. Tonight, it was a dormant black rectangle waiting for a signal. I held my smartphone in my palm. The sleek metal chassis felt cold against my skin. "You are partially correct, Ashley," I said. My voice was a calm, measured counterweight to her hysteria. A printed document can indeed be fabricated. Signatures can be forged by a skilled hand. If Richard had taken Grandmother Beatrice's heirloom serving trays to a generic neighborhood pawn shop, I might have had to rely entirely on that single printed page to make my case. I took another slow step toward the center of the dining room. The extended relatives shifted in their seats, pulling away from the table, as if the mahogany wood had suddenly caught fire. But Richard did not go to a generic neighborhood pawn shop, I continued. He needed a substantial amount of liquid cash, instantly. He needed discretion. He needed a broker accustomed to handling high-value, unregistered goods without asking uncomfortable questions. So he drove his leased luxury vehicle to a very specific, high-end boutique on Newbury Street. I kept my eyes pinned on Richard. He had collapsed back into his carved wooden chair, his spine curved, deflating into the furniture like a marionette with its strings abruptly severed. The spilled wine dripped slowly from the edge of the table, pooling onto the expensive Persian rug near his leather loafers. He did not move his feet to avoid the dark red stain. "The problem with seeking out a discreet broker," Richard, I said, projecting my voice to ensure the aunts and cousins heard every syllable, "is that corrupt boutiques attract specialized attention. My forensic accounting firm does not just audit angry divorces or local contract disputes. We partner with federal regulatory agencies to track illicit cash flow across state lines. For the past 6 months, my team has been conducting a joint investigation into that exact Newbury Street boutique. The owner was operating a sophisticated money laundering front for overseas clients. We had his accounts frozen. We were monitoring his daily transactions, looking for anomalies. The air in the dining room grew incredibly thin. The collective breathing of 20 people seemed to stop entirely. Aunt Helen covered her mouth with her linen napkin. Cousin Derek lowered his gaze to his lap, unable to watch the brutal dismantling of his uncle's empire. "You chose the absolute worst building in the entire state of Massachusetts to fence stolen estate property," Richard I stated. My tone was clinical, outlining a fatal miscalculation. "You walked directly into the epicenter of an active federal financial dragnet." Ashley stopped waving the paper. Her arm dropped heavily to her side. The shrill, defensive energy began to leak out of her, replaced by a deep, creeping terror. She did not fully understand the intricate mechanisms of federal audits, but she understood the gravity of the vocabulary. Money laundering, federal agencies, dragnet. These were not terms associated with petty family squabbles over missing silverware. They were the vocabulary of prison sentences and asset forfeiture. When I recognized the boutique's name on your bank ledger, I paid the owner a personal visit. I explained. It was Tuesday morning. The air outside was freezing, but inside the shop the owner was sweating, just like you are now. I did not need a police warrant. I walked into his showroom and presented my corporate credentials alongside the official probate registry of Beatrice's estate. I watched Richard slowly bury his face in his hands. His broad shoulders heaved with silent, dry sobs. I informed the boutique owner that he had just purchased $30,000 worth of stolen family heirlooms from an executor committing felony embezzlement. I told the quiet room. I explained that concealing those items would upgrade his current financial charges to federal obstruction of justice. He was already looking at a decade behind bars. He had zero loyalty to a desperate real estate developer from Concord. To save his own business license and avoid a federal obstruction charge, the owner flipped. Instantly, I continued. He unlocked his secure filing cabinet and handed over the notarized bill of sale. He surrendered the itemized receipt Ashley is currently trying to tear apart. But he did not stop there. I said, my thumb hovering over the glass screen of my smartphone. A cooperative witness always over-delivers when they are trying to save their own skin. He wanted to prove he had no prior knowledge the silver was stolen. He wanted to prove you acted entirely alone. So, he opened his security closet. He extracted the master hard drive from his digital surveillance system and handed it directly to me. The silence that followed was absolute. The grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to stop ticking. The toddler in the high chair sat completely still, sensing the terrifying shift in the room's atmosphere. Ashley stared at me, her jaw slack. The forged receipt defense evaporated into thin air. She could no longer hide behind the excuse of fabricated ink. The cognitive firewall she had built to protect her father was burning to the ground. She opened her mouth, but her vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. Vivian remained glued to the hardwood floor. She looked at her husband. She looked at the man weeping silently into his palms. He was not denying the accusation. He was not jumping up to threaten a defamation lawsuit. His complete physical surrender was the final nail in the coffin of their curated reality. I looked down at the bright screen of my phone. I navigated to the encrypted media folder. I selected the high-definition video file the boutique owner had exported for me. "I do not need to argue about forged signatures, Ashley," I said, my voice soft but echoing with absolute finality. "I do not need to debate the authenticity of a printed logo. We are going to watch it happen together." I tapped the wireless casting icon on my screen. I selected the massive smart television mounted on the wall behind the patriarch's head. The television emitted a low electronic chime. The dormant black rectangle instantly woke up. The dark glass shifted to a bright, vivid blue, indicating a successful wireless connection. The sudden burst of light illuminated Richard's defeated, slumping silhouette. 20 pairs of eyes snapped away from me and locked onto the glowing display. The screen flickered a second time, adjusting to the incoming high-definition resolution. The final, undeniable truth was queued up, and the playback was about to begin. The massive 85-inch television screen flickered from a bright, vivid blue to a crystal-clear 4K video feed. The digital timestamp in the upper right corner read Tuesday, November 22nd, 10:14 in the morning, exactly 2 days prior to our Thanksgiving dinner. The high-definition surveillance camera was mounted near the ceiling of the Newbury Street Antique Boutique, providing an unobstructed panoramic view of the showroom. The image quality was pristine. The lighting was sharp. There was zero room for debate or mistaken identity. The visual evidence was absolute. The video began with a heavy glass door swinging open. The motion triggered a cheerful electronic chime over the shop's audio feed. The sound echoed through the silent Concord dining room, an eerie, cheerful contrast to the suffocating dread suffocating the relatives. Uncle Richard walked into the frame. 20 heads tilted slightly upward, fixated on the glowing rectangle. No one breathed. No one blinked. On the screen, Richard wore the exact same expensive tailored cashmere sweater he was currently sweating through at the head of the dining table. The high-resolution lens captured the deep anxiety etched into his features. He looked over his shoulder before letting the glass door close behind him, an involuntary paranoid reflex. But the most damning element was not his clothing or his nervous demeanor. It was the heavy object gripped tightly in his hands. He was carrying the polished mahogany box, the velvet-lined container that Aunt Vivian had dramatically opened just 20 minutes ago to unleash her theatrical scream. The box was unmistakable. The ornate brass clasp glinted under the boutique's track lighting. It was the physical embodiment of my grandmother Beatrice's legacy, and Richard was gripping it like a stolen television set. A collective suppressed gasp rippled around the long dining table. Aunt Helen pressed both her hands flat against her cheeks, her eyes wide with unadulterated shock. Cousin Derek stopped leaning back in his chair, sitting up rigidly straight as he watched his uncle's undeniable guilt broadcast across the wall. The audio from the boutique's microphone kicked in, broadcasting Richard's voice with terrifying clarity. "Good morning," Richard announced on the video, walking toward the glass display counter. His tone was forced, trying to project the booming confidence he always relied on to mask his failures. "I spoke to you on the phone earlier. I have an estate lot I need to liquidate quickly." The boutique owner stepped into the frame. He was a shorter man wearing a dark vest. He looked at the heavy mahogany box and raised an eyebrow. "Put it on the counter," the owner instructed. "Let us see what you brought." Richard hoisted the heavy box onto the glass surface. He unlatched the brass clasp and pushed the wooden lid back. The camera angle provided a perfect top-down view of the interior. The velvet lining was not empty. The heirloom silver gravy boat, the heavy, intricate serving platters, and the ornate slotted spoons rested securely in their designated slots. The silver shone brilliantly under the shop lights. The real crime was no longer a theory. It was no longer a printed document or a forensic deduction. It was a visceral, visual reality playing out in front of the entire extended family. "They are beautiful pieces," the boutique owner remarked, picking up a heavy slotted spoon and inspecting the hallmark. "Mid-century sterling, very heavy. Where did you acquire these?" Richard let out a short, nervous laugh. The sound grated against the quiet dining room. It was the laugh of a coward trying to minimize his betrayal. "Oh, you know how it is," Richard said, waving his hand dismissively on the video. "Old junk from my mother's attic. She passed a couple of years ago, and my wife finally told me to clear the clutter out of the house. We are redecorating the dining room for the holidays. Modern, minimalist lines. This bulky stuff just does not fit the new aesthetic. I just need it gone. Quick and painless." The phrase "old junk" hit the dining room like a physical blow. Aunt Vivian let out a strangled, choked sob. She slumped backward, collapsing heavily into the nearest wooden chair. Her legs simply ceased to function. She stared at the screen, her mouth hanging open, watching her husband reduce her mother's cherished legacy to an inconvenience. The matriarch, who had spent the last hour demanding my car keys and threatening police action, was reduced to a hollow, shaking shell. I stood in the center of the room, perfectly still. I did not narrate the video. I did not point out the blatant lies Richard was telling the dealer. The footage was doing the brutal, heavy lifting for me. I allowed the silence of the room to amplify the damning audio. On the screen, the boutique owner set the spoon back into the velvet box. "I can give you $14,000 cash right now," the owner offered. "Or I can write you a check for $16 if you want to wait for the funds to clear on Monday." Richard did not hesitate for a single second. "I will take the cash," he replied, his voice tight with desperation. "Today, right now. Do you have the paperwork ready?" The boutique owner pulled a white itemized receipt from beneath the glass counter. It was the exact same document currently resting near Ashley's trembling hand on the dining table. The owner slid the paper across the glass alongside a black ink pen. "Sign at the bottom confirming you are the sole legal owner of the items the owner instructed." The camera zoomed slightly, providing a tight focus on the transaction. The family watched Richard click the pen. They watched his hand move across the paper, scrawling his signature on the seller line. There was no hesitation. There was no lingering guilt over stealing from his own wife and children. He signed his name with the frantic speed of a man trying to outrun a burning building. The boutique owner retrieved a thick stack of banded $100 bills from a secure drawer. He placed the cash on the counter. Richard snatched the money with alarming speed. He did not count it. He shoved the thick, banded stack deep into the inside pocket of his tailored cashmere coat. "Thank you," Richard said on the video, forcing another hollow laugh. "Have a good holiday." He turned his back on the velvet box, abandoning my grandmother's legacy on a stranger's glass counter. He pushed the heavy boutique door open and hurried out onto Newberry Street, disappearing from the camera frame. The video feed ended. The massive 85-inch television screen automatically reverted to a flat, dormant black rectangle. The sudden silence in the Concord dining room was absolute and devastating. The electronic chime, the rustle of cash, the nervous laughter, it all vanished, leaving behind a suffocating vacuum of truth. The illusion was dead. The golden pedestal the family had worshipped for 15 years was pulverized into dust. I locked my smartphone and slid it back into the pocket of my trousers. The screen went dark, signaling the end of my presentation. I looked at Uncle Richard. He remained slumped in his center seat of honor. He had not looked at the television screen once during the playback. He kept his face buried deep in his palms, refusing to watch his own execution. The spilled wine continued to drip slowly onto his expensive leather loafers. He was a broken man, completely stripped of his defensive armor. I turned my gaze toward Ashley. The golden child was frozen. She still gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles white, but the defensive rage had entirely drained from her posture. Her eyes were wide pools of sheer terror, staring blankly at the black television screen. The forgery defense was annihilated. The fake receipt theory was crushed. She could no longer blame the quiet niece in the drafty corner. She was forced to confront the horrifying reality that her entire life, her upcoming wedding, her designer wardrobe, and her social standing was funded by a criminal who stole from his own family to maintain a pathetic charade. My stoic silence acted as a mirror. For 15 years, this family had forced me to absorb their shame. They had projected their insecurities onto my quiet life in Boston. Now I was holding the mirror up and forcing them to look at the ugly, undeniable reflection they had created. The trap had snapped shut. The forensic audit was complete. But the human ego is a resilient, venomous organism. When a narcissist is stripped of their primary defense mechanism, they do not surrender gracefully. They inevitably initiate a trauma response, seeking a new target for their overwhelming shame. The truth was exposed, but the fallout was just beginning to mutate into a desperate, misdirected rage. The immediate aftermath of a collapsed illusion is never peaceful. When you corner a narcissist with undeniable evidence, they do not experience an epiphany of remorse. They do not suddenly realize the magnitude of their cruelty and offer a sincere apology. That requires a baseline of empathy that simply does not exist in their psychological architecture. Instead, they execute a desperate trauma response. They pivot. They attempt to redirect the overwhelming shame they feel by turning the spotlight onto the person holding the mirror. Cousin Ashley had built her entire identity around the myth of Uncle Richard's infallible success. Her upcoming wedding, her luxury car, her social standing in Concord were all financed by a ghost. Now the ghost was exposed as a desperate thief weeping quietly into his hands at the head of the dining table. Ashley could not handle the devastating reality of her father's guilt. It meant she was no longer the golden child of a wealthy patriarch. It meant she was the daughter of a criminal facing a potential federal obstruction charge. The cognitive dissonance fractured her composure entirely. She dropped the itemized receipt onto the white linen tablecloth. Her hands curled into tight, trembling fists. Her face flushed a deep, mottled red. The silence in the dining room, the suffocating weight of the truth, became unbearable for her. She had to break it. She turned her venomous gaze away from the dark television screen and locked it onto me. "You are a monster," Ashley shrieked. Her voice cracked, tearing through the quiet room like a jagged saw blade. She lunged forward, leaning across the mahogany table until she was nearly shouting directly in my face. The cubic zirconia pendant around her neck swung violently against her chest. "How long have you had that video, Gianna?" she screamed. "How long did you sit there watching us look for the silver? You let my mother cry. You let us panic. You planned this entire spectacle just to humiliate us on a holiday. You set a trap for your own family because you are a sick, vindictive spy." Her pivot was a textbook maneuver. It is a defense mechanism I have observed in dozens of high-stakes depositions. When a fraudster is confronted with a ledger proving their embezzlement, they rarely argue the math. They argue the method of discovery. They attack the auditor. They accuse the investigator of violating their privacy, claiming the pursuit of the truth was a malicious personal vendetta. Ashley was applying corporate defense tactics to a Thanksgiving dinner. She was attempting to rewrite the script so that Richard was the victim of a calculated ambush and I was the true villain of the evening. The extended relatives sitting around the long table watched this hysterical outburst with wide, stunned eyes. Aunt Helen gripped the edge of her chair. Cousin Derek stared at his plate, unsure of how to navigate the sudden shift in the family dynamics. A few minutes ago, they were ready to crucify me based on a lie Ashley had invented. Now they were watching that same cousin desperately try to deflect from undeniable, high-definition evidence. I did not retreat. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands in a defensive posture or attempt to match her shrill volume. When an abuser attempts to rewrite the premise of an argument, engaging with their emotional hysteria only validates their narrative. You must dismantle their logic with clinical detachment. I kept my hands resting easily at my sides. I looked at Ashley, her face twisted in rage, her chest heaving with exertion. I allowed her shrieking to echo off the wainscoting and slowly fade into the heavy silence of the dining room. I absorbed the attack without a single blink. "Ashley," I said. My voice was pitched low, but it carried a crisp, cold resonance that forced the entire room to lean in. "You are attempting a very common psychological pivot. You are trying to make my method of investigation the central crime of the evening because it is less painful than acknowledging the reality of your father's actions. She opened her mouth to shout again, but I raised a single index finger. The subtle, commanding gesture silenced her instantly. "Let us examine the facts of your argument," I continued, my tone steady and unyielding. "You are standing in the middle of a dining room, screaming at me because I acquired a security video. You are calling me a monster for uncovering the truth. Yet you have not spoken a single word to the man sitting beside you." I gestured toward Richard, who remained slumped in his chair, refusing to look up. "Your father stole your grandmother's cherished heirloom silver," I stated, emphasizing each word deliberately. "He packed it into a velvet box, drove it to a money laundering front, and traded his wife's legacy for a stack of cash to cover his massive hidden debt. He then came home, sat at the head of this table, and allowed you to falsely accuse me of a felony. He watched you demand the keys to my car. He watched your mother demand to search my purse. He was perfectly willing to let me take the fall for his crime." I took a slow step forward, narrowing the physical distance between myself and my cousin. "But you are not angry about any of that, Ashley," I pointed out, my voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "You are not devastated that he stole from Vivian. You are not horrified that he lied to your face. You are only enraged because I refused to play the role of the quiet scapegoat. You are furious because I shattered the illusion you desperately rely on." Ashley stepped back, retreating slightly from my unblinking stare. Her hands shook violently. She looked at her mother. Vivian remained paralyzed in her chair, staring blankly at the empty credenza, unable to process the total destruction of her curated life. Ashley looked to her extended relatives, seeking an ally, seeking someone to validate her outrage. But the echo chamber was broken. Aunt Helen looked away. Cousin Derek stared at the spilled wine on the floor. No one was willing to jump onto a sinking ship. I turned my attention back to the broader audience, addressing the entire room. "For 15 years, this family has operated on a preferred narrative," I announced. "You decided I was the troubled niece, the isolated failure in the city, the outsider who could be blamed whenever something went wrong in this pristine house. You preferred the comfort of a lie over the discomfort of the truth." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the stunned relatives. "But the truth does not require your permission to exist," I continued. "I am not the villain in this story. I am simply the person holding the mirror. If you do not like the reflection staring back at you, do not blame the glass. Blame the architect of the lie." The silence that followed was profound. It was not the tense, pressurized silence of a looming argument. It was the heavy, exhausted silence of a battle definitively lost. Ashley slowly sank into her chair next to her weeping father. Her defensive energy completely evaporated, leaving behind only the hollow realization of her impending social ruin. The trap had closed. The investigation was complete. I had successfully cleared my name and dismantled the toxic family dynamic that had suffocated me for over a decade. I could have ended the confrontation right there. I could have picked up my leather tote bag, walked out the heavy front doors, and left them to suffocate in the wreckage of their own making. But my forensic audit of Richard's limited liability companies had uncovered a final, horrifying detail. A detail so devastating it elevated his crime from simple desperation to an act of profound structural betrayal. The $14,000 he received for the silver was merely a symptom of a much larger terminal disease. And since Ashley was so desperate to protect the illusion of her father's wealth, I decided it was time to show her exactly what that illusion had cost her. The primary conflict was resolved, but I was preparing to deliver the final, absolute blow. The heavy stillness in the dining room pressed down on the remaining guests like a physical weight. The extended relatives were paralyzed in their carved wooden chairs, unable to look away from the wreckage at the head of the table. Cousin Ashley had retreated into a defensive shell, her eyes darting frantically across the room, searching for a new escape route. But there was nowhere left to run. The perimeter was secured. The evidence was irrefutable. Uncle Richard finally lifted his head from his hands. His face was a portrait of total devastation. The pristine, tailored cashmere sweater was stained with sweat at the collar. His skin carried a sickly, grayish pallor. Tears streamed down his cheeks, carving shiny tracks through the sheen of perspiration. The imposing, confident patriarch who had dominated the first course was entirely gone. In his place sat a broken, desperate man grasping at the final fragile threads of his dignity. "Gianna," he rasped. His vocal cords sounded like dry sandpaper. "Please, you have to listen to me." He reached a shaking hand across the table, his fingers hovering inches away from the spilled pool of dark red wine. "It was a mistake," Richard wept, his voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "It was a one-time error in judgment. I got a bad stock tip from a partner at the firm. I was leveraged on a commercial property, and the market shifted overnight. The bank issued a margin call. They were threatening to seize the primary business accounts. I just needed a quick bridge loan to cover the gap until the next quarter. I was going to buy the silver back. I swear to you, I was going to replace it before Vivian ever noticed." He looked at his wife, pleading for a shred of sympathy. Vivian did not blink. She stared at him as if a stranger had just broken into her home and sat down at her dining table. I let his pathetic excuse hang in the air for exactly 3 seconds. "Stop talking, Richard," I said. My voice was not loud, but it possessed the sharp terminal edge of a steel blade dropping onto a chopping block. He flinched, pulling his trembling hand back into his lap. "You do not get to construct a new lie simply because the old one expired," I continued. "You are sitting there weeping about a bad stock tip. You are trying to frame this as a temporary cash flow hiccup. You want your wife and your daughter to believe that fencing family heirlooms was a frantic, isolated incident." I took a slow step forward. The heels of my boots clicked softly against the hardwood floor. "But I am a forensic accountant, Richard," I reminded him, my tone clinical and precise. "I do not deal in isolated incidents. I deal in longitudinal data. I audited the entirety of your limited liability companies. I traced the wire transfers across every single ghost account you opened over the past 18 months." I shifted my gaze away from the weeping man and focused directly on Ashley. The golden child was hugging her arms tightly across her chest, shivering despite the warm heat radiating from the fireplace. "You were very loud a few moments ago, Ashley," I observed, maintaining my flat, unbothered delivery. "You were screaming about forged receipts. You were desperate to protect the illusion of your father's wealth because your entire lifestyle depends on his credit cards. You assumed the $14,000 he received for the silver was the extent of the damage." Ashley swallowed hard. Her pale throat bobbed. A fresh wave of dread washed over her features. She recognized the structural shift in my vocabulary. She knew the execution was not over. $14,000 is a negligible sum to a successful commercial real estate developer, I explained, pacing slowly near my drafty corner chair. It is a drop in the bucket. It does not save a failing enterprise from a catastrophic margin call. It barely covers a fraction of the interest on a defaulted loan. I stopped pacing and locked eyes with my cousin. "So the forensic question becomes obvious," I stated. "Where did Richard find the rest of the capital to satisfy his angry creditors?" Ashley shook her head slowly, side to side. Her breathing turned shallow. A primal instinct was telling her to run out the front door, but her legs remained pinned to the chair. "You are getting married at the country club in June." "Ashley," I said, navigating the conversation toward the most devastating ledger entry of my entire audit. "It is going to be a beautiful, lavish event. I saw the vendor contracts in Richard's digital files. The venue required an $80,000 down payment to secure the ballroom. Richard told you he wired that deposit 2 months ago, did he not?" Ashley parted her lips. A tiny, broken squeak escaped her throat. She managed a single, jerky nod. "He lied," I said. The word struck the table like a hammer. "He never wired the funds to the country club," I revealed. "The venue deposit was a phantom entry on a fabricated spreadsheet. He diverted that $80,000 directly into his failing corporate accounts to stave off bankruptcy." Your wedding venue was quietly canceled 3 weeks ago due to non-payment. You have been planning a reception in a ballroom you no longer possess." Ashley let out a sound that I will never forget. It was not a word. It was a guttural, soul-shattering wail. It originated deep within her chest and ripped through the quiet dining room, conveying a profound, agonizing loss. The cubic zirconia pendant around her neck heaved as she doubled over, pressing her forehead against the edge of the mahogany table. But Richard did not stop there. I continued raising my voice, just enough to cut through Ashley's relentless sobbing. $80,000 merely delayed the inevitable. The creditors returned. The margin calls multiplied. He needed more liquid assets. He needed an untraceable source of cash that did not require a bank signature. I looked back at Richard. He was staring at the floor, a dead man waiting for the dirt to fall over his casket. "Grandmother Beatrice loved you, Ashley," I said, addressing the weeping girl. "When she passed away, she established a secondary trust fund in your name. It was meant to be your safety net. It contained $250,000. Richard was appointed as the sole fiduciary executor of that trust. He was supposed to transfer the control to you on your 30th birthday." Vivian gasped, inhaling a sharp, ragged breath. Her hands flew to her mouth. She finally understood the full, terrifying scope of her husband's betrayal. "Your father liquidated your entire trust fund," Ashley, I announced. The final anvil dropped, shattering the very foundation of the estate. He forged the beneficiary release forms. He emptied the accounts and poured every single penny into his insolvent real estate ventures. The money is gone. It vanished into a black hole of commercial debt and terrible investments. Ashley pounded her fists against the wooden table. Her perfectly styled hair fell across her face in chaotic, tangled strands. Her golden child status was pulverized. The designer dresses, the imported pastries, the pristine image she projected to her friends, it was all funded by a toxic illusion. She was penniless. She was the victim of a devastating financial crime perpetrated by the very man she had spent the last hour fiercely defending. I surveyed the wreckage of the Thanksgiving dinner. The poetic justice of the evening was absolute and unforgiving. "You sat in that chair an hour ago, Richard," I said, directing my final assessment to the patriarch. "You mocked me in front of our extended relatives. You offered me a junior bookkeeping job to help me pay my modest city rent. You wanted the room to pity me so they would admire you." I stepped closer to the head of the table. "But I own my apartment in Boston," Richard I stated, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal authority. "I possess a thriving corporate career. I carry zero debt. You, meanwhile, possess a negative net worth. You are functionally bankrupt. You stole from your dead mother. You embezzled from your own daughter. You are a destitute parasite, clinging to a lifestyle you can no longer afford." Vivian turned her head slowly. She looked at Richard. The man she had spent 3 decades building her ego around was exposed as a hollow fraud. The disgust radiating from her eyes was palpable. She did not reach out to comfort him. She did not offer a soothing word. She looked at him with the cold, clinical revulsion usually reserved for a dangerous stranger. The primary conflict had reached its absolute zenith. The antagonists, who had spent 15 years pushing me to the geographic and emotional fringes of the family, were entirely destroyed. They were crushed, not by my anger, but by the sheer crushing weight of their own financial and moral bankruptcy. The toxic ecosystem was dead. I did not smile. I did not gloat. Gloating is an emotion reserved for people who harbor lingering doubts about their victory. I felt only the quiet, sterile satisfaction of a balanced ledger. The math was finally correct. The truth was laid bare under the harsh chandelier light. There was only one final task left to perform before I walked out of that house forever. The dining room resembled the smoldering aftermath of a localized natural disaster. The polite, curated veneer of the holiday dinner was stripped away, leaving only raw, fractured reality. No one looked at me anymore. I was no longer the focal point of the room. The toxic ecosystem had turned its predatory instincts entirely inward. Aunt Vivian stood up from her chair. Her movements were stiff and mechanical. She leaned over the table and swept her arm across the pristine white linen. She knocked a crystal wine goblet to the hardwood floor, where it shattered into a dozen glittering shards. She did not scream. She simply stared down at Richard with a look of profound, sterile disgust. The patriarch was weeping into his folded arms, a hollow shell of the man who had commanded the room an hour prior. The extended relatives began to scramble. Aunt Helen grabbed her purse from the back of her chair, murmuring something incoherent about needing to check on her dog. Cousin Derek stood up and backed away from the table, treating his uncle like a contagious patient. The mob mentality that had united them against me was dead. They were fleeing the sinking ship, desperate to distance themselves from the stench of financial ruin and felony embezzlement. I stood near my drafty corner chair, observing the chaos, with the clinical detachment of an auditor closing a final ledger. In the past, I might have waited for an apology. I might have lingered, hoping someone would acknowledge the 15 years of unjust scapegoating. I might have wanted Vivian to look me in the eye and admit she was wrong. But forensic accounting teaches you a valuable lesson about human nature. You cannot extract genuine remorse from an empty bank account, and you cannot extract a sincere apology from a bankrupt soul. Closure is not a gift your abusers hand to you wrapped in a neat bow. Closure is a door you must close yourself. I reached down and picked up my leather tote bag. The heavy brass zipper glided shut with a smooth metallic sound. I draped the straps over my shoulder. I walked away from the drafty corner. My boots clicked against the polished hardwood. The relatives parted to let me pass, stepping aside as if I were a ghost. I did not head straight for the foyer. I altered my trajectory, navigating toward the center of the long mahogany table. I stopped beside Cousin Ashley. The golden child was slumped forward, her face buried in her folded arms. Deep, racking sobs shook her slender frame. Her entire identity, the upcoming country club wedding, the luxury lifestyle, the effortless superiority, had evaporated into thin air. She was mourning the death of a mirage. I reached into the front pocket of my tailored trousers. My fingers brushed against the cold metal edge of my grandmother Beatrice's silver appraisal loop. I pulled the heavy brass instrument into the warm light of the chandelier. I did not ask for permission. I leaned down and gently slipped my index finger beneath the delicate gold chain resting against Ashley's collarbone. I lifted the heavy, shimmering pendant she had been flaunting all evening. The large, clear stone dangled in the air, catching the ambient glow of the room. Ashley gasped, startled by the sudden physical contact. She lifted her tear-streaked face and stared at me. Her eyes were red and swollen. I held the magnifying glass up to the stone. I did not need a long inspection. A trained eye requires only a fraction of a second to spot the distinct lack of carbon inclusions and the unnatural rainbow light dispersion characteristic of a synthetic gem. The hallmark of a fraud is always visible if you know where to look. I let the pendant drop. It hit her collarbone with a hollow, insignificant clink. "Cubic zirconia," I whispered. My tone carried zero malice. It was a simple statement of empirical fact. He has been faking it for years, Ashley. The wealth, the status, the superiority, none of it was real. Ashley stared down at her chest. Her hand trembled as she touched the synthetic stone. A fresh wave of agonizing realization washed over her features. The final, lingering shred of her father's illusion was extinguished. He had not just stolen from his mother and emptied his daughter's trust fund. He had dressed his family in cheap glass and convinced them they were royalty. I turned my back on her weeping form. I walked toward the far wall of the dining room, where the antique mahogany credenza rested. The velvet-lined wooden box sat open and bare, a striking physical reminder of Richard's betrayal. I stood in front of the empty container. I thought about my grandmother sitting at her kitchen table, teaching a 10-year-old girl how to separate the truth from the lies. She had built this house. She had curated this legacy. Her son had traded it away for a brief reprieve from his own incompetence. But he had not taken everything. He could not sell the quiet, unyielding strength she had passed down to me. I opened my hand and placed the brass appraisal loop gently onto the pristine green velvet. The metal glinted against the dark fabric. It was a silent tribute, a final offering to the woman who taught me how to read the hallmarks. I did not need to carry the magnifying glass in my pocket anymore. My vision was perfectly clear. I turned away from the credenza and walked out of the dining room. I did not look back. I did not say goodbye. I retrieved my wool coat from the hall closet. I pushed the heavy oak front doors open and stepped out onto the brick pathway. The harsh, stifling heat of the colonial estate vanished instantly. The crisp Massachusetts air hit my lungs like a shock of pure adrenaline. A fresh layer of snow had begun to fall, dusting the pristine boxwood hedges in a brilliant, stark white. The bitter cold felt clean. It felt like freedom. I walked down the long driveway, my boots leaving deep, solitary footprints in the fresh powder. The distant sounds of shouting and shattering glass echoed faintly from the house behind me, but the noise felt small and insignificant. It was the sound of a collapsing structure, and I was already miles outside the blast radius. I reached my car, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. I started the engine, letting the heater warm the quiet cabin. I put the vehicle in drive and steered away from the gated estate, leaving the burning wreckage in my rearview mirror. There is a moment in every scapegoat's life when staying silent stops being a survival tactic and starts becoming an endorsement of the abuse. I had just reached mine. The truth is a heavy burden to carry, but it is infinitely lighter than dragging around the weight of someone else's lies. That is my story. 15 years of unearned guilt wiped clean by a single itemized receipt and a high-definition video file. The most valuable thing I brought to Thanksgiving dinner was not the homemade bourbon pecan pies. It was the irrefutable proof that dignity always outlasts cruelty. If you are sitting at a table where your effort is banished to the garage while their artificial display takes the center stage, take this as your sign. You do not owe them your peace. You do not owe them your protection. True power is not about screaming the loudest or throwing the biggest tantrum. True power is holding the undeniable truth quietly in your pocket until the exact right moment. If this story resonated with you, drop a comment below and let me know how you walked away from your own toxic table. Hit the subscribe button to join our community. Thank you for listening to Aura Vengeance. I will see you in the next one. Driving away from that sprawling colonial estate in Concord, the crisp Massachusetts snow falling gently against my windshield, the profound silence of the open road, offered a stark contrast to the hysterical wreckage I had left behind in the dining room. As the adrenaline of the evening slowly faded, it was replaced by a deep, quiet melancholy. The tragedy of that Thanksgiving was not simply the theft of a velvet-lined box of heirloom silver, nor was it the dramatic exposure of a bankrupt patriarch. The true tragedy lay in the generational decay of a family, a slow-motion collapse brought on by a complete failure of parental responsibility and a profound lack of moral guidance. When we look at the ruins of Uncle Richard and Aunt Vivian's life, it is easy to focus entirely on the stolen money and the forged receipts. But the most devastating crime they committed was not against the probate court. It was the crime they committed against their own daughter, Ashley. In American culture, we are often sold a specific version of the traditional family dream. We are taught that success is measured by the zip code we inhabit, the prestige of the universities our children attend, and the effortless superiority we project to our neighbors. Richard and Vivian bought into this illusion so completely that they forgot the foundational purpose of parenting. They believed that protecting their daughter meant shielding her from the reality of struggle. They wrapped Ashley in a cocoon of designer labels, catered pastries, and a manufactured sense of entitlement. But a parent's primary responsibility is not to purchase a frictionless life for their child. It is to equip them with the emotional resilience, the moral clarity, and the uncompromising honesty required to navigate a world that will inevitably test them. By funding Ashley's life with stolen money and lies, Richard did not elevate his daughter. He hollowed her out. He handed her a cubic zirconia pendant and told her she was wearing a diamond. He raised a child with zero emotional awareness, someone who fundamentally believed that her worth was tied to her father's bank account. When that bank account was exposed as a mirage, Ashley did not just lose her country club wedding. She lost her entire identity. She was left weeping at a dining room table entirely unequipped to handle the harsh, unforgiving light of the truth. That is the ultimate betrayal of the parental duty. When you raise a child in a house built on deception, you guarantee that they will eventually be crushed when the roof caves in. Contrast that with the quiet, enduring legacy of my grandmother Beatrice. She did not teach me how to project false wealth. She did not teach me how to look down on others to make myself feel taller. She sat me at her kitchen table and handed me a heavy brass appraisal loop. She taught me how to look past the shiny, silver-plated exterior of the world and search for the hallmark of authenticity. She provided the kind of long-term guidance that traditional family structures are meant to foster. She understood that fairness and honesty are not just abstract concepts to be discussed on Sunday mornings. They are the very tools required for survival. Beatrice gave me the emotional awareness to recognize my own worth, even when the rest of the family tried to relegate me to the drafty corners of their lives. That is what true inheritance looks like. It is not a gravy boat. It is not a trust fund. It is the unshakable internal compass that allows you to stand perfectly still in a room full of screaming people, knowing that your reality is anchored in the truth. Raising children with this kind of emotional awareness requires parents to do the hardest work of all. It requires them to be honest with themselves. It demands that a patriarch admit when he has failed, rather than embezzling from his family to maintain a facade. It demands that a matriarch foster fairness between all members of the household, rather than creating a toxic dynamic of golden children and designated scapegoats. When parents project their own insecurities onto their children, they create an echo chamber of anxiety and resentment. They teach their children to value the performance of success over the quiet dignity of integrity. We tell these stories not just to revel in the spectacular downfall of arrogant people. We tell them because they serve as a mirror to our own lives, our own dining room tables, and our own parenting choices. We share these experiences to break the cycles of generational toxicity that hide behind the polished oak doors of supposedly perfect homes. We want to empower you to look at the dynamics in your own life and ask the hard, necessary questions about what you are accepting, what you are ignoring, and what you are passing down to the next generation. If you have ever felt like the scapegoat in your own family, if you have ever had to quietly hold on to the truth while the people who were supposed to protect you spun a web of lies, you are not alone. There is a profound strength in quiet observation. There is immense power in refusing to accept an abuser's premise. We invite you to continue exploring these themes with us. Follow the channel Aura Vengeance, where we dissect the quiet boundaries that dismantle loud arrogance. Subscribe to our community, share your own stories in the comments, and join us as we continue to shine a light on the hidden truths of family dynamics. As I drove further away from Concord, the glow of the city lights reflecting off the snow-covered highway, I thought about the empty velvet box sitting on the mahogany credenza. I thought about the families all across the country gathering around their own tables, passing dishes, exchanging smiles, and hiding their own quiet resentments beneath the polite chatter. We all inherit something. Some of us inherit debts, some of us inherit trauma, and some of us are lucky enough to inherit a brass magnifying glass that helps us see the world clearly. The question we are ultimately left with is not about what was handed to us. The question is what we choose to do with it. When the guests leave, when the candles burn down, and when the performative noise of the holiday fades into the silent winter night, you have to sit alone with the reality you have built. You have to look at the reflection in the dark window pane. Is the life you are living real all the way through? Or is it just another silver-plated lie waiting for the hallmark to fade?